on challenges and prospects for the Chagos archipelago. My name is Laura Jeffery, and I'm one of the co-editors along with my colleagues Chris Monaghan and Mario
Ik
Gorman.
moen ban trois co-éditeurs, à côté de mon ban collègue Chris Monaghan.
Thank you to David Vine for organising the book launch as an author, not a co-editor. So we really appreciate that you've gone the extra mile for us today. Now, to everyone who speaks English but not Creole, please bear with me while I direct the Creole speakers to our simultaneous translation channel. So, bonjour et bienvenue dans le lancement du nouveau livre, l'Urban Défi et opportunité pour l'archipel Chagos. Moi, je m'appelle Laura Jeffery et je suis parmi trois co-éditeurs, à côté de mon collègue Chris Monaghan et Mairi O'Gorman, qui tous les deux avec nous aujourd'hui. Aujourd'hui, la plupart contributions pour en anglais, mais le Zoom nous a un interprète qui peut faire traduction en même temps en créole. Alors, si vous préférez écouter en créole, s'il vous plaît, cliquez sur l'icône Interpretation en bas Zoom. Et là, vous besoin choisir French, mais pas gain tracas, il peut en créole même. Nous peinons un interprète le Facebook Live. Alors, si vous payez leur Facebook Live, vous êtes capable sans leur Zoom pour traduction créole. Pendant la session questions-réponses, vous êtes capable de poser une question en créole si vous préférez. Entre-temps, si vous avez une question, s'il vous plaît, servez chat là, soit en anglais, soit en français, soit en créole, n'importe, et que nous puissions répondre nous dans une langue préférée. À ce là qui vous fait gagner le temps de choisir traduction créole, me pourrez sans en anglais. Merci. Thanks everyone. Okay, so I'm just going to describe to you what our ambitious plan is for the day, which is basically to aim for approximately 45 minutes for some poetry readings and summaries of the 18 chapters. And I'm going to chair this first session. And then approximately 45 minutes for questions and answers, which will be chaired by Chris Monaghan, who's one of the other co-editors of the book. At the outset, we would like to ask all participants to be sensitive to the complexities and controversies of the situation that we're discussing today. As probably most, if not all of you know, there's a wide variation of perspectives within and beyond the Chagossian community. And we do know that many Chagossians do not feel that their voices are adequately heard, including in this book. And what we'd like to do today is try to create a reflective, informative, and inclusive space for conversation and potentially the development of future work together. Now, this book is dedicated to all Chagossians who did not live to see a return to their homeland. So what I'd like to do to start us off is to begin with a poem, Histoires Chagossiens nous tout besoin amenli, by Chrisyl Wong-Hang-Sun, who is with us on the call. Chrisyl, over to you.
Hi everyone. So this poem is dedicated to Mimose Percy, of whom I had the privilege of speaking to during my fieldwork, and who was concerned that with Chagossian history getting lost with younger generations migrating to the UK. So this is a call for us to continue to engage with the Chagossian history. Histoires Chagossiens nous tout besoin amenli. We spoke for a fleeting moment, and yet you revealed a lifetime. Cause blag blagge, these winds carry stories. Your laughter a tale of endurance, your eyes a testament to pain. Bizem Marzali, qui nous peut faire, for these winds carry our stories. Your words, your way with words, a foothold within my memory, standing the test of mortality. These winds must not carry our stories. These winds that forced us into exile, these winds that cannot carry us home, these winds that falsely shape our narratives. Histoires Chagossiens nous tout besoin amenli.
Thank you, Chrisyl. It's a beautiful poem and a really helpful call to action as well to launch our book launch. So to take you back a little bit, I'd like to tell you about the origins of the book itself. So the contributors to this book came together at a conference held in May 2023 to commemorate the 50th anniversary since the final deportation from the Chagos archipelago, which had taken place in May 1973. Despite that passage of 50 years, this book is really timely, given very recent developments such as the ongoing sovereignty negotiations between the Republic of Mauritius and the United Kingdom since 2022, which have been in the news as recently as yesterday, I think. The book chapters were finalized before the announcement in October last year that an agreement had been reached. So only the introduction actually mentions that agreement. But as we all now know, even that agreement itself hasn't stood the test of time. So we hope that the chapters will still seem relevant to readers now and in the future. And we're considering organizing a follow-up event if and when an agreement is eventually finalized. But in the meantime, today's book launch focuses on the contributions of our book itself. Our book is inclusive. Firstly, it brings together specialists from right across the arts, humanities, and social sciences. Secondly, it includes chapters not only by established researchers, but also by early career researchers, including those of Chagossian descent. And thirdly, it incorporates chapters by experts from out with academia, including from practitioners with long-standing professional engagement. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to take you through the table of contents, and those authors who are present with us today will present their own chapters, and those who are absent today because they were unable to join us, I will present their chapters for them. If you're here and you're an author of a chapter and I start talking about your chapter because I didn't know that you were here, please interrupt me and take over. All right, Mairi, could we share the table of contents, please? I'll start at the top with chapter 1, which is by barrister and Mauritian former diplomat Milan Mitarban, who I think is not with us today. Okay, so this first chapter provides a historical overview of the detachment of the Chagos archipelago and the deportation of Chagossians. And the chapter describes successive judicial proceedings brought by Chagossians and their descendants, alongside attempts by Mauritius to assert sovereignty under international law because of incomplete decolonization. Chapter 2 is by Indian Ocean historian Richard B. Allen, who I think is also not able to join us today in person. And this chapter situates the 18th and 19th century history of the Chagos archipelago as a dependency of colonial Mauritius in the social and economic context of the Indian Ocean. And what this chapter seeks to do is to clarify the links between Chagossians and other Afro-Creole people in the region through histories of slave trading, indenture, plantation labor, and forced migration. Chapter 3 is by another Indian Ocean historian, Priya Bahadur, and this chapter traces the economic and social history of the Chagos archipelago into the 20th century and the moment of detachment and deportation. And what this chapter does is chart the formation of Chagossian groups. It locates the Chagossian struggle in a long and intimate material relationship with the islands, and it highlights the importance of women's political action in the context of Chagossian resistance. Now I just want to pause to say something about poems, because we've already heard from Chrisyl, whose poem opens the collection, and we actually have a bunch of poems, 7 poems scattered through the book. And so the next entry in the table of contents is a poem called So Immaculate, Peros Banos, Salomon, Diego Garcia by Saradha Soobrayen, who is a British Mauritian poet who was hoping to be with us but is unwell today. The next chapter, chapter 4, is by post-colonial studies scholar Chrisyl. And this chapter examines the Chagos archipelago through the language and imagery of paradise, an idea that informed French and British imperial expansion and colonial exploitation. And one of the things that Chris does in this chapter is show how, whilst Chagossians have described the archipelago in these terms as a paradise, Hill shows how this framing has also been mobilized against their return, particularly through the depiction of Chagos as untouched in the creation of the marine protected area. And the marine protected area provides us a thread through to the next chapter, chapter 5, which is by law professor Soobrayen, who I thought might be here but does not seem to be. And in this chapter, Farron shows how the Chagos Marine Protected Area is subject to conflicting rights claims, so fishing rights, national and international security, sovereignty, the human rights of Chagossians, and the rights of non-humans. Chapter 6 is by law professor Charles M. Fombad, who, again, I thought was due to be here with us today, but doesn't seem to be. Apologies if I am missing anyone. And in this chapter, Fombad examines the implications of the return of Chagos to Mauritius, with particular attention to the status of Chagossians under the Mauritian constitution. The next chapter, chapter 7, is by myself, Laura Jeffery. I'm an anthropology professor, and in this chapter I seek to evidence the ways in which Chagossians meet the criteria for ethnic minority and indigenous people. But in the chapter I argue that the implications of recognition as an ethnic group and an indigenous people are actually quite limited in practice due to the power imbalances that inhere in the very structures that confer these kinds of statuses. All right, now the next author really is here. Chapter 8 is by Chagossian social scientist Thierry Mondarin, and this chapter reflects on the experiences of Chagossian descendants in Manchester and on their feelings regarding the UK Nationality and Borders Act. And the chapter focuses both on the challenges associated with cultural trauma and on how these historical roots facilitate growth and hope for the future. Thierry, are you ready to speak to your chapter? Thierry, I'm just asking Thierry to unmute.
Hi, everybody. Sorry, I'm having a bit of technical difficulties on my side.
No worries, it's all difficult.
Yeah. Just a short kind of where my chapter goes to. So I did an ethnography piece in Manchester, which is very interesting, and we kind of spoke about some of the themes that were coming through, such as cultural identity. I think whilst previous research is focused on Crawley, I really wanted to focus on another area that hasn't been done before, which was Manchester. But I wanted to take the literature away from cultural trauma, but more towards ambition, growth, transformation of the Chagossian community and how we are unified in some areas. But yeah, kind of to talk about that unity and what we do and what we don't do from a Manchester perspective, I thought was really strong. So that's me.
Thank you, Thierry. That's fantastic. And I will just keep us moving in the interests of time. All right. So the next thing that we have is actually a poem, another poem. It's called Ayapana in a British Plant Pot by Chrisyl Wong-Hang-Sun. And then that's followed by Chrisyl's own chapter. So Chrisyl is a Chagossian anthropologist and poet. And in the chapter, Wong-Hang-Sun considers the perspectives of older Chagossians active with the Chagos refugees group in Mauritius, who are oriented towards future action despite past hardship and present uncertainty. And Chrisyl's chapter is then followed by another poem by Chrisyl called Lemuria is in Our Trust. And Chrisyl, as you all know, because we've already had a poetry reason, Chrisyl's here. So I'm going to hand over to you, Chrisyl, to do whatever you want with your section of poem, chapter, poem.
Okay, great. I think I'll start by giving a brief breakdown of my chapter, and then maybe I'll read one of the poems, or I'll read the last one as well at the end. So my chapter is based on fieldwork conducted in 2023 with native and older generation Chagossians, based mostly at the Chagos Refugees Group in Mauritius. And as a diaspora that has been involved in numerous legal battles and court cases, I was interested in how Chagossians perceive the Nationality and Borders Act that had just been signed into law in 2022. The main questions I explored were, what are the immediate perceived effects of the Act? Are native and older generation Chagossians interested in migrating to the UK? How do they think the Act will affect their familial and communal relations? How do they conceptualize law more generally? And finally, do they still have hope to return home? My research conclusions center around keywords and phrases communicated to me during the course of my fieldwork. Those include la loi, which is law, l'espoir, which is hope, l'avenir, which is future, and cote moi-même, which is a phrase used to describe feeling at home. With the migration of young Chagossians to the UK, Chagossians fear that their knowledge and fight to return home will fade away. There was a lot of uncertainty expressed when Chagossians mentioned the Act and how it could divide families and the broader community. What Chagossians expressed in certainty, however, was their legal right to return home. This was certainty expressed through what I call insistent practice, i.e., volunteering, legal battles, material knowledge dissemination, which reinforces their self-knowledge and their hope. I describe their hope as rooted in the certainty of their self-knowledge, situated on a direct and focused path toward returning home to the Chagos. And whilst also exploring how Chagossians used the word l'avenir, I was faced with more uncertain expressions. As Chagossians worked to build a life for themselves in the UK, prospects of better opportunities were met with fears of isolation, loss of culture, and difficulties assimilating to the pace of life and climate in the UK. But equally here, I was also introduced to what scenarios or conditions Chagossians are able to feel at home away from the Chagos. The ability to connect with other Chagossians, often at the Chagos Refugees Group, sharing meals and conversation is reminiscent of the unity felt in the Chagos. I feel myself at home, I was told. Cote moi-même literally translates to at me myself, but it is used in reference to feeling at home. Spaces like the Chagos Refugees Group, where Chagossians can partake in Chagossian cultural practice, reinforces their sense of home and their sense of self. So there are two overarching themes, certainty and uncertainty, that flow within my chapter. A people that have faced immense injustice and uncertainty, it was both uplifting and empowering as a Chagossian descendant to experience the certainty of what it means to be Chagossian. And I'm just going to end by reading the last two sentences of my chapter. The British government illegally stripped my people of our land, our home, and our livelihood, and continue to block our right to return. And yet, the knowledge of who we are remains steadfast. Being native to and descendants of our homeland is the certainty of our perpetual lived experience, something the British government could never take away from us.
Thank you, Chrisyl. That's great. Okay, we will move now on to the next chapter, chapter 10, which is by literature professors Esther Pujolras Noguer and Felicity Hand. And in this chapter, they draw on a creative writing workshop that they conducted with members of the Chagos Refugees Group in Mauritius. And what they're doing in this chapter is positioning the plight of the Chagossians in relation to other forced displacements and other forms of creative expression across the Indian Ocean region. And Felicity is here, I hope, to talk about their chapter.
Okay, good afternoon, everybody. With my colleague Esther Pujolras Noguer, we decided to conduct what we call a creative writing workshop. Well, by that, we don't mean we were trying to train people to write. What we wanted to do is to get the Chagossians to talk to us about their experiences. And we wanted them to feel that their values, their culture is something which has to be spoken about. And how we wanted to know how they had managed to conserve or recreate their culture in this case, Mauritius. We worked with the group of volunteers from the Chagos Refugees Group in Port Louis, thanks to our dear friend and colleague Farhad Khoirati from the University of Mauritius, who sadly passed away. We got in touch with them, and many of them volunteered. And we were very pleased because we had people from different age groups. We had original deportees, sort of second generation and third generation. And a real comforting atmosphere was formed in this. So what we wanted to do was to hear their own words, because we'd read, obviously, accounts written by anthropologists, historians, and so forth. We'd read novels, fictionalized accounts of the Chagossian tragedy, but we thought, well, this is not good enough. We wanted to hear their own voices. So this was 2019 when we organized this workshop. And as we understood that some of the older people didn't have very, they had very basic schooling, so we weren't going to get them to actually write. In fact, it's the younger generation who acted as scribes very often. We wanted them to talk. That was the important thing, for them to voice, their feelings about having been, deported and how they were getting on in the new country. And just to give you an example, because we used a lot of visual material, because we thought that was, we couldn't have too much text. So we did have some short extracts from material by novels and so forth, and poems written by people from other countries, other than the so-called post-colonial world, who were also writing about people living in the diaspora, people living in exile. And just to give an example of, how it worked, we had a very short extract from the novel By the Sea by Nobel Prize winner Abdul Razak Gurna, in which his character, Saleh Omar, has to flee Zanzibar because otherwise he'll be imprisoned or killed. And he tries to get into England. And he's at Gatwick Airport, and he's stopped by this very officious customs official. And, he searches his luggage and finds his little casket of perfume. And of course, for the character, this little casket of perfume was something which really connected him to his homeland, which he knew he was never going to see again. And this really got them talking, because it really resonated with them, because they understood what it was to have, your own possessions stolen from you. And, it was daylight robbery. And of course, they linked it up to the fact that their homeland had been stolen from them. So we had very intensive sessions, and we feel that they believe that their stories were being valued, which is an important thing. Yeah. And in fact, I should say, even though it's the younger generation who were acting as scribes, writing down, what the older people were saying, it's the older people, the original deportees, who were the most articulate. And just on one occasion, we had one lady who just burst into song, and it was really so moving. So we feel we've, added a little grain of sand, just so people know about, the Chagossian people, and not just what's being written about them, but about what they themselves, think. So we're hoping to repeat the experience sometime in the future. So we feel, we are, well, as is often the case in these situations. I mean, Esther and myself, we felt we learned much more from them than they did for us. But again, it was an experience for them to actually have their say. Thank you.
Thank you, Felicity. Okay, so the next thing in the book is another poem by Saradha Soobrayen called This Poem is Intuitively Aware of the Erasure of the Chagos Archipelago. And it's followed by an excerpt from Natasha Subramanian and Luke Williams's prize-winning novel, Diego Garcia. And in this excerpt, and in the book in general, they are interrogating how US and UK diplomats deployed this concept of fiction so as to expedite the displacement of the Chagossians. That's followed then by chapter 12, which is by academic lawyers Satvinder, Juss and Chris Monaghan, who are here today. And their chapter explores the extent to which justice has been delivered by British courts, despite resistance from the UK government. They argue that legal action and political activism have made Chagossian voices audible, even as the colonial mindset of UK institutions has tried to silence them. And I'm going to hand over to Satvinder or Chris to speak to their chapter.
Thank you, Laura. Satvinder and I had the privilege of writing about the British courts and the Chagos stories, an exercise in colonial injustice, or And what we did was we framed our discussion within the historical concepts of colonialism and how this related to British constitutional law. We looked at British colonial actions in the past, for example, the notions of empire as articulated in the 18th century, the challenges to imperialism put forward by people like Edmund Burke when empire was done badly, drew parallels with Burke's successful attempt to bring impeachment proceedings against Warren Hastings, the first Governor General of Bengal. And we really questioned what it meant within UK constitutional law, this notion of empire. And we very much viewed colonialism, imperialism, and constitutional law as one and the same. You can't separate out domestic British constitutional law from constitutional law with regards to the empire. We looked at how the courts had tried to remedy the Chagos injustice. So we looked at the Bowcott litigation, which started in the 1990s, looked at the decision of Lord Justice Laws in the Divisional Court in Bowcott number 1, and then examined the House of Lords decision in 2008, which followed in Bowcott number 2, which arguably led to a disappointing outcome with regards to the protection of rights and also the proper effective accountability of the government with regards to the use of its prerogative powers. And Satvinder, did you want to add anything?
Thank you. Just a couple of points. In the Bowcott litigation, you see the employment of a constitutional provision, actually a colonial provision, where the government can legislate in the interests of peace, order, and good government. And that is a provision that the Imperial Parliament that in London used, as far afield as Australia, New Zealand, Tasmania, India, and so on and so forth. And it's a provision which has really given carte blanche to the colonial government to do whatever it wants in the interests of peace, order, and good government. And it was a provision that was used in the Bowcott case to effectively expel the entire population. And when it comes to our own courts in Britain, two judges in the Court of Appeal very robustly and adamantly take the view that peace, order, and good government necessarily implies that the people are meant to be governed. If you expel the population, there's nothing to govern. And so therefore, this was a very denial and corruption of that provision. That's the one thing that really came to our mind when we were writing the legal aspect of it. The other thing which I think is very, very troubling about the case is the use by civil servants of language such as the removal of Man Fridays and Tarzans from the archipelago, and none of that would have been known to us had it not been for the fact that WikiLeaks actually disclosed all of this stuff, for which the person involved has up to now paid a very, very heavy price. But I think that was really very resonant of the kind of colonial mindset, Man Fridays and Tarzan footprints and the like and so on, which really has not been so fully explored, because if there's one thing that really indicates the virulent racism that affected the very way in which, and continues to affect to this day, the very way in which this particular population is being dealt with, I think that's really quite a sobering realization.
Thank you, Satvinder and Chris. That's grand. Okay, and this brings us on to chapter 13, which is by academic lawyers and practicing barristers, Stephen Allen, Thomas Bury, and Jamie Trinidad. And this is actually a reprint of an amicus curiae submission in the maritime delimitation proceedings between Mauritius and Maldives at the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea. And in these, the Chagossian Committee of Seychelles emphasized the distinct rights of Chagossians as an indigenous people rather than as a subset of the people of Mauritius, arguing that they therefore have a right to be consulted and benefit from marine spaces and resources in the Chagos archipelago. The next chapter, chapter 14, is by Defense and National Security researcher Samuel Bashfield. And this chapter demonstrates that the acquisition of the Polaris nuclear ballistic missile program was intertwined from the outset with the formation of what was called the British Indian Ocean Territory, but that the relationship between these two events was concealed, thus allowing the UK to maintain its status as a dominant power and thus feeding into the other fictions, as discussed already today, used to justify the displacement. This brings us to chapter 15 by anthropology professor David Vine, who is with us today. And in this chapter, David argues that the US was the senior partner, first conceiving of the idea of the base, then insisting on the expulsions, and then aiding in the cover-up. And in this way, he argues that the US outsourced the violence of displacement, paying the UK to absorb culpability. And so Vine concludes that both the UK and the US are responsible for resettlement and should pay compensation to the Chagossians. Over to you, David.
Thanks so much, Laura, and thanks to everyone for being here and those watching the video later. It's really a pleasure to see this exciting group of people. Thank you also to the co-authors. I'm thrilled to be working together. And also just a thanks to not just Laura, but to Mairi and Chris, the co-editors of the book, for bringing us all together and making this book possible. I do want to say one more important thanks, which is a thanks, of course, to the Chagossian people who've been leading their struggle for justice for more than half a century and are now closer to achieving some small measure of justice, the justice they deserve, closer than ever. So rather than focus on my chapter, I am going to focus instead on this moment. The moment does illustrate the argument of my chapter that while the crime of exiling the Chagossians has two authors, the US and British governments, that the US government is and has always been the senior partner, the power behind the British throne, even though the British government has received the vast majority of the criticism and attention. And I'll focus on this current moment by saying, please ignore Donald Trump. Please ignore Donald Trump. Please ignore Donald Trump. Now, it's not my place to tell Chagossians what they should do or how they should their struggle for justice. So what I'm offering is my analysis of the political situation, but it is clear to me that the Mauritian and British governments can, and I think should, ignore Donald Trump and the US government. The US government is not the sovereign in Diego Garcia or in the Chagos Islands. It is clear that the Mauritian and British governments can, and again, I think should, finalize the deal that, while deeply imperfect, would be a step forward for the decolonization movement, for democracy, for the rule of international law. And when they finalize this deal with the treaty, they can and should correct the major error in the deal, which is that the original announcement prohibited Chagossians from resettling on Diego Garcia. It only allowed their resettling on the other Chagos Islands. This is an error that can and should be corrected in the final deal. Let me also just say that people should ignore the nonsense, the real lies that have been spread by people on the far right in Britain and the United States, politicians, members of the media, who are spreading, again, what are nonsense and lies about this deal benefiting China or Russia or Iran. People are seemingly grasping at straws to pull out any argument they can muster and make up to try to kill the deal and entrench Anglo-American colonialism in the 21st century. And with that, let me just conclude that by saying that at this moment, when we see Donald Trump embracing old school colonialism from Gaza to the Panama Canal Zone to Greenland and beyond, that this is a moment where a deal and the finalization of the deal for the Chagos Islands would be a real step forward for the rule of international law, for the decolonization movement, and for democracy, which is, again, to say, please ignore Donald Trump.
Thank you, David. I'm sure many people can agree, at least on the desire to ignore Donald Trump. David's chapter is followed then by another poem by Saradha Soobrayen called UK Ambassador Lobbied Senators to Hide Diego Garcia's Role in Rendition. And that brings us then quite neatly on to chapter 16, which is by political scientist Peter Harris, who argues that US-China rivalry has been used as a justification for the existence of the US military base on Diego Garcia, which again I think links back to what David Vine was saying just now. Chapter 17 is by freelance journalist Owen Bowcott, and it's an account of a journey he made alongside a group of Mauritian officials, lawyers, journalists, scientists, and Chagossians to Chagos in 2022. And Bowcott describes the tensions surrounding the assertion of Mauritian sovereignty and the very temporary homecoming of displaced Chagossians. And we have an audiovisual presentation from Owen that I think David Vine is going to share with us. Owen, do you want to say anything before we hand over to the recording?
I mean, just to say that I was working for The Guardian when I went on the trip, but I was very privileged to join that trip in February 2022, almost exactly 3 years ago. But if you want to play the video, and then I'll add a few words afterwards, if that's okay.
I apologize. Let me try again. Did you see the screen?
Yes, we could see it, but it was static and there was no audio.
Yeah. Maybe that might. Power of my computer may have everything going on all the time. I apologize, everyone. This is my technical difficulties. Owen, do you want to say a few words? As I think I'm going to shut Keynote down and then.
Okay, yeah, I can pick up and then you can run it when you want. One of the odder things about it, by delicious irony, the ship we travelled on from the Seychelles to the Chagos, which is renamed the Bleu de Nîmes, was in fact a converted former British minesweeper. So it could be argued that this was gunboat diplomacy in reverse. Are you ready to run? Or
yeah, let's try it again. Fingers crossed, everyone.
3 years ago, the Mauritian government chartered a luxury yacht for its first expedition to the Chagos archipelago since the creation of British Indian Ocean Territory. The media were in atoll. It was the first time Chagossians, expelled to make way for a US military base, had been able to visit without close supervision by British officials. The sight of their former abandoned homes, overgrown by creepers and coconut palms, was a source of delight and distress. Giant coconut crabs with powerful claws have become dominant predators. Islanders are forbidden from returning, but yacht crews with a buyout permit can visit. They have littered shores that are supposed to be pristine nature reserves. St. Bridget's Chapel on Salomon Atoll lost its roof as the jungle encroaches. Rusting iron rails surround tombs on the island's cemetery. In an act of diplomatic defiance, Mauritian officials also organized flag-raising ceremonies on Solomon and Peros Banos. It was a formal assertion of sovereignty. After the expedition departed, British ministers announced that the Mauritian flag had been removed. Thanks. I don't know if you saw the pictures, but I hope the sound came through. While we were there, we never met any British or buyout officials during our time on Solomon and Peros Banos, but we were shadowed for a period by a UK-operated fisheries protection vessel. And during that time, curiously, our Wi-Fi stopped working altogether. It only started again when the boat disappeared. One of the details that has stuck most forcefully in the minds of those deported in the early 1970s was the unnecessary cruelty inflicted on their pets. Everyone on the outer islands was ordered to leave them behind, but some loyal dogs swam out from the shore to the waiting Noguer, the cramped supply vessel on which families were being removed, in an attempt to rejoin their owners. The pets were forced back ashore and later either shot or gassed by British officials once the families had been expelled. One element of the expedition was to measure tidal levels on the partially submerged Blenheim Reef on the northernmost tip of the archipelago. The purpose was to gather evidence for a hearing of the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea about maritime and subsea boundaries between Mauritius and the neighbouring Maldives. The tribunal had ruled in 2021 that Mauritius, and not the United Kingdom, has sovereignty over the Chagos Islands. The graveyards on the islands appear to have been relatively well preserved from the surrounding vegetation, but all other buildings on Peros Banos and Salomon atolls have been left to fall into a state of ruinous decay. Rosamond Bertien, one of the 5 Chagossians on the expedition with us, found a rusting enamel bedpan inside the walls of the community hospital where she had given birth to her son William in 1972. Olivier Bancu, who was christened in the Saint-Sacrement Chapel on Peros Banos, led efforts during the short time we were ashore to clear creepers and fallen coconuts from the floor of the roofless building. It must have been agonizing for them to return home and yet know that they had to leave again so soon. While we were watching the red, blue, yellow, and green Mauritian flags being run up the flagpole on Peros Banos, almost exactly 3 years ago, firm promises were made to the Chagossians that they would have a right of return to their birthplace, at least to the outer islands. There has certainly been, there's obviously been a change of government in Port Louis since then, but we should make sure that those pledges are honoured. Thank you.
Thank you, Owen. Okay, that brings us to the last chapter, and then we have another poetry reading after the last chapter. Chapter 18 is by British former diplomat David Snoxell, and it rounds off the collection by bringing us up to date, at least as far as the negotiations undertaken since 2022 between the Republic of Mauritius and the United Kingdom relating to sovereignty of Chagos Archipelago. And David is here with us, so I shall hand over to you, David.
Thank you, Laura. Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes,
You
correct.
can, good. Sometimes it breaks down. Thank you for introducing my chapter. I was very conscious of why, when writing it now, nearly 2 years ago, that it would be out of date, and it is out of date by now. However, I did try to go over some of the more recent history of the reasons for this prolonged delay. We have to keep in mind that discussions on Chagos between the UK and Mauritius actually go back to the early 1980s and have continued on and off to this day, especially during Margaret Thatcher's premiership. Now, I also do try to see ahead. If Chagos had not been detached in 1965 from Mauritius by the British government, where would Chagossians and Chagos be today? And it seems to me the answer is really obvious. Chagossians would still be living there. Chagossians would have had a measure of autonomy, such as has applied to Rodrigues and other islands in Mauritius, and the Chagos Islands would still be part of Mauritius. I think we have to keep that in mind as a background. Now, let me just finish off by saying, where have we got to? Because since the book was published, there's been quite a number of developments, which I won't go into. I was pleased to hear David Vine say what he did about taking no notice of President Trump. But this is one subject on which President Trump has not opined at all. His administration have, lots of people close to him have, but he has not himself. And I think one should take that as a good sign. So where things are today is that there is complete agreement between the two sovereign governments, the UK and Mauritius, that have negotiated the agreement. There is complete agreement over that agreement. What we're waiting for is the green light from President Trump. But I have to say it may be a red light, so nobody can be certain about the outcome. It will be very soon, I'm sure of that. And then the question arises, if it's the red light, will Prime Minister Starmer be able to stand up to the pressures that will be on him? There are enormous local political pressures, international pressures, and to that pressure from the United States. Would he be strong enough and courageous enough to stand up to it and go through with the agreement? So I think I'll leave that question mark in your mind, if I may.
Thank you, David. And now we will bring the formal part of the book launch to a close in the manner with which we opened it, with a poetry reading from Chrisyl Wong-Hang-Sun, who's going to read the poem that closes the collection, which is called Ode to Chagossians Histoire.
Thanks, Laura. Yeah, this particular poem kind of bore out of my feelings after fieldwork and kind of hearing about how communal and harmonious and how peaceful life was on the Chagos, and yeah, it bore out of those feelings. It's titled, Ode to Chagossians Histoire. Down where the river meets the sea, an old man sits beside me. With his long white beard and skin a rich noir, he begins to share with me our histoire. Long ago we knew these waters. Long lived our sons and our daughters. Together we moved to the beat of the shore, a harmony that cannot exist anymore. At the source of the river flowed abundant life, without any tension, pain, or strife. We had balance, at peace with our land, as she nurtured us with her generous hand. But now all of that is lost. A disrupted balance, and at what cost? And as you strive to reach for the stars, is it worth the money, power, and call to arms? Down where the river meets the sea, an old man sits beside a coconut tree, weaving his basket to harvest some fruit. I realized I was wrong in my pursuit. For greed and desire can never be satisfied, and the lust for more must be cast aside. to make space for the things that bring us life. With the river, sea, and land we must unite. Returning to the source of my being, I no longer succumb to that which is fleeting. Down where the river meets the sea, a wise old man has set me free.
Thank you, Chrisyl. So that brings us to the end of the formal launch of our very nice new book. And I hope you've enjoyed the whistle-stop tour of the book. And what I'd like to do now is hand over to Chris Monaghan, who's one of the other co-editors of the book, who's going to chair the question and answer session for the next 35 minutes or so. Over to you, Chris.
Thank you, Laura. I would just like to reiterate on behalf of Laura and Mairi and myself, just a massive thank you to David Vine for organising today's book launch. It's been an absolute pleasure to attend, to listen to some fantastic poetry, and to hear from our fellow authors. So, as anyone knows who's ever done a project like this, it's really only possible because of the entire team. And as David said, definitely a collective effort. So thank you, and thank you to everyone attending. Now we've got about 30 minutes for questions. So if you have a question, could I ask you to either raise your hand or put the question in the chat box? I'll endeavour to come round to every question in the chat box, but it'd be quite nice if you could raise your hand or put the question in the chat box. And Laura's on hand as well to translate as well. So any questions whatsoever for any of our contributors, any of the editors? If you wanted to hear anything more about a particular chapter, or from Owen about his visit to Chagos. So we've got a question from David Vine.
Well, I will only, yes, Laura has alerted me I should be looking on Facebook Live to see if any questions are posted there. Let me just, I'm speaking slowly, both as a model for encouraging people to speak slowly, because we have a wonderful interpreter, Amira, and want to just make things as easy as possible. But I also, if someone has a question that's been brewing, want to see what let that person speak. My question is to ask any of the other authors to comment on the current political moment and what they make of the debate and controversy over the deal between Mauritius and the UK.
And if I could quickly just jump in as well, we also have another question from Eva Maria about any developments in relation to the Maldives. So if contributors wanted to also respond to that point as well, in addition to David's point.
On Eva Maria's question, the authors who contributed the Amicus Curiae are not with us today, but I would suggest that if anyone would be able to answer the question on updates in relation to the Maldives, it would be one of the academic lawyers. So I'm looking at Chris Monaghan, Satvinder Juss, or Richard Gifford, who's also with us today. And if not, there are a couple of questions, Chris, for Owen, I think. Well, one question for David Snoxell about the beginning of the negotiations, and one question for Owen about the visit.
Thank you, Laura. And we note we have got Richard Gifford in the audience today. Richard has actually played an absolute pivotal part in the litigation through the domestic courts, and also in the discovery of colonial documentation, which outlined the background to the creation of the Chagos Islands. So I think, as Laura said, we've got a question for Owen. Owen, how did it feel to go and visit the Chagos Islands?
It was an enormous privilege and it was absolutely fascinating to be there. There was, I think, quite a lot of negotiations between Mauritius and the UK government immediately beforehand. I don't think they were very happy for us to go. We tried, I think they initially wanted to go from the Maldives, which would have been a shorter voyage. But the Maldives said they wouldn't allow any journalists to join. And the Mauritian government, I think, were very keen for there to be a media presence. The BBC were on board, as well as Mauritian television channels, reporters, and the Atlantic magazine and the Guardian. So the Mauritians were very keen to get media coverage of it. And in the end, we went from the Seychelles. It was a 5-day voyage there. And I think the agreement had been that we could go to the northern islands, Peris, Banos, and Solomon Atoll, and Blenheim Atoll, but we weren't going to go anywhere further south than that. The Mauritians, I suspect, slightly broke the nature of the agreement, or at least sprung a surprise by going around and raising their flags on a number of the islands in defiance of British claims at that stage of outright ownership. So yeah, there were a lot of politics swirling around at the time, and it was only about 8 months after we got back that the British government agreed to enter negotiations on returning it. One thing I must admit, in a way, I don't know whether people can put pressure on it to say that the argument increasingly in the last few months has been over Diego Garcia and the reparations or the cost of the continuing 99-year lease. There seems to be slightly more agreement on allowing Chagossians to return to the northern atolls, Peris, Banos, and Solomon. So if political pressure was put, it maybe agreement could be reached by all sides. Maybe even President Trump would allow people to start the process of returning to the Northern Islands, even while political agreement is disputed over Diego Garcia on the terms of any lease. Thank you.
Thank you, Owen. And I wondered whether David Snoxell, you could say anything about the ongoing negotiations. As you mentioned, negotiations were starting from the 1970s and 1980s onwards.
Yes. Well, the current negotiations between the UK and Mauritius have concluded. That's clear. And although we don't know all the details of the agreement, we do know that both sides, including the Americans, have agreed that Chagossians can visit Diego Garcia, but not yet settle there. And that all three sides are in agreement about resettlement on the Chagos Islands. However, I don't really expect Mauritius to go with it until it has sovereignty of or practical sovereignty of the outer islands. And everything all really does hinge upon the agreement over Diego Garcia and the 99-year lease. I can't comment on how much it's going to British taxpayer. There's been a vast avalanche of comment in the media about it, with some extraordinary figures that have arisen out of that. We'll only know that after there is an agreement. However, I think there ought to be a fallback position, but I don't want to at this moment describe a fallback position for fear of upsetting the current position, which it is quite possible Donald Trump will not object to. I put it that way. And if he doesn't object, then I think it's quite possible that the UK and Mauritius could go ahead with it. He doesn't actually have to say in favour of it.
Thank you, David. We have a few more. Another point in the chat box from Diego Garcia about thank you for everyone for the huge work they're doing. I may not be Chagossian by birth, but I grew up with some of the children who were deported with their parents. And I remember it was a sort of taboo subject for them to say where they came from. So they would just refer to themselves as Creole, there's ils. So thank you. And that must be... Oh, so Laura said Chrisyl would like to say something about negotiations. So over to you, Chrisyl.
Yeah, I guess it's more kind of just to talk about feelings and to say that they are quite varied. I guess when I heard the news, I was at work and I told my manager, and then she was like, "Why don't you take some time to go think about this?" So I went for a 2-hour walk, and yeah, like it. I think the part that I feel quite, I guess, sad about is that Chagossians are not united in one perspective, and there are many different perspectives that people feel, and we all come from different kind of experiences, and especially as a diasporic people growing up in different countries, and I guess feeling the divisiveness in light of the negotiations is quite an interesting thing to be feeling. I think one of the things that and whilst it does sound quite good for decolonization, to return the islands to Mauritian sovereignty, I think kind of Chagossian calls for self-determination go continually ignored, and also the kind of, with the original announcement and the way in which the UK and the US agreed to renew the lease on the base in Diego Garcia for another 99 years, which would bar Chagossians from resettling there. That is quite, that's not very good news. So I guess, yeah, mixed feelings, and it's quite difficult kind of being a Chagossian descendant to navigate those feelings. I don't know if that contributes much, but I guess, yeah, that's how I'm feeling.
It does, because it actually it's such an emotive subject. So many different views, as you said, within the Chagossian community. Issues of decolonization in terms of Mauritius, but also self-determination for the Chagossian people, and it raises many questions, many concerns, and I think it's apparent this is not a straightforward area, and the negotiations, whatever road they lead to, it's still going to raise many questions and leave many things unanswered in terms of desired outcomes. So thank you. That was a really helpful contribution.
I respond to it.
Yeah, yes, of course, David.
Well, I agree, Chrisyl, that the division among Chagossians has been a factor which has made the negotiations that more difficult to achieve a settlement. On the question of self-determination, which is always mixed up with a referendum, I think one has to state that the international legal position is that self-determination applies to the whole people of Mauritius, of whom Chagossians are a part. So if there were ever a referendum, it would include the whole people of Mauritius. And I think you know what the outcome of that would be. It's therefore not particularly sensible to go down the self-determination route for that reason. You will not get the result that those who want the British Indian Ocean territory to remain British forever, that will not be the result. So I personally don't think it's a constructive way forward. But if this deal comes out right and Chagossians are resettled with the help of Mauritius, I'm quite sure, as I think I've said before, that there will be a measure of autonomy very similar to the one in Rodrigues, where they have their own national assembly and their own administration. But of course, Rodrigues has a population of some 35,000, and it's much easier to do than with a small population. And there's no saying how many people from the Chagossian communities are going to want to return. Or many of them, all of them, I would say, want their right to return restored, but I'm not at all certain how many would actually want to go and live there.
Thank you, David. We have another comment in the chat box from Garcia about the Chagossian community and a discussion about the Seychelles. And in response as well, Sabrina Jean has highlighted the fact that the Seychelles group is still active with the chair, Pierre Prosper. We have a question from Maxwell. Good afternoon, Maxwell.
Hi, good afternoon. Thank you very much for letting me intervene. I just don't see how I can relate to what Mr. Snoxell is saying. I have a lot of document that proves that Chagossians are an ethnic people. They are different, completely different to Mauritian. And the idea of Mauritius being Chagos Islands being an integral part of Mauritius has been asked by the ICJ, and they've ruled for Mauritius. But the question of self-determination for the Chagossians have never been asked anywhere. We were born there. We were brought there by the French, and for the UK to lie, to say that there was no permanent population, and to go and do an agreement in secrecy in the 1965, and then today history is repeating itself. I don't see how I can relate to what Mr. Snoxell is saying. It is completely wrong what happened to Chagossians, and what is happening today, just giving their land, giving everything away, is, do you know what? Even myself, I can't bring myself to sleep anymore. I cannot bring myself with so much suffering, mental health, or what they are doing and what they've done to our people. It's very, very wrong. And by doing this deal, it's just going to aggravate it. It's not going to make anything better for us.
Maxwell, thank you very much for your contribution and your giving your perspective on what's going on. And as Laura said in the beginning, this is an area where there are many views, many perspectives. What we want to do is hear from everyone's perspective, everyone's views on this, because this is an issue that affects people. And it's not just an academic issue, it's an issue that affects the Chagossian population. Do we have any more? We have time for a few more questions. So any more questions from the audience? So we have a question from Ian Walker.
Hello, thanks. Let's see if I can lower my hand. Yeah, I mean, as a couple of you know, I did some research with the Chagossians a very long time ago for my master's thesis. And I've been following from afar, but I'm not completely familiar with what's going on. But I had a couple of questions. One is pursuing, and it's probably quite a long conversation about the role of the Chagossians in this. And I don't actually know, and maybe if someone could just explain to me whether they did have any sort of formal role in the negotiations. And my second question, I think, is probably one to lawyers, because these days I work in the Comores, and amongst the islands there is, of course, Mayotte, which bears a lot of similarities insofar as Mayotte was detached from a French colony, but following the wishes of the population. And of course, it is almost the opposite, whereby the French held a referendum, which they later interpreted island by island, and said that they would respect the wishes of the people of Mayotte to remain French, and so dismembered the territory prior to independence. And they've continued to justify this. And I was wondering, from a legal point of view, if any of the lawyers have any sort of comment on the similarities between the two cases, where you have effectively a colonial territory which was dismembered, and one of the islands remained the possessions of the colonial power, but now going in different directions, where the British are relinquishing it and returning the territory to the former colony. In the case of Mayotte, that would be pretty much impossible, not only from the political and economic perspectives, but also being against the will of the majority of the population. So a couple of questions, if I could just a sort of technical question about the role of the Chagossians in the negotiations between Britain and Mauritius, and then a more wider legal question to lawyers on the comparative character of these two situations. Thanks.
Thank you, Ian. Would anyone be able to respond to Ian's question about the role of the Chagossians in negotiations?
Yeah, yes. All I can say is that the position of HMG, Her Majesty's government, is that there were 4 consultation sessions with Chagossians during the course of the 2 years of negotiation. And the Foreign Office itself has had meetings with them. So I really can't comment beyond that.
Thank you, David. And from a legal perspective, the best people to have responded to that were Jamie Trinidad, Thomas Bury, and Stephen Allen, who wrote the international law themed chapter in the collection. But I think it does raise, if I can say from a constitutional point of view, it does raise a lot of interesting questions as to kind of self-determination, and also the legitimacy of essentially carving up a territory, as in the case of Mayotte, and also with Mauritius with regards to the Chagos. And I think it is interesting. I agree, it's completely different, but it boils down to the legitimacy of doing that in the first place. So Maxwell, I've got another question for Maxwell.
Oh, hi. My name is Beatrice Pompe. I'm a native. I was born on Diego Garcia. And I don't think Maxwell's questions was answered. So I'm a bit confused. Are we just making statements, or are we getting answers for the questions we asked?
Thank you, Beatrice. Would you have to put the question again to the contributors, if that's okay?
Well, he asked about the deal about Diego Garcia going to Mauritius. How can that be? How is that right? And then the native won't be allowed to resettle on Diego Garcia? We don't trust Mauritius to do anything for us. So how don't we have a voice to say that we don't want Mauritius to have Diego Garcia because he wasn't theirs in the first place. We are not Mauritians. We were not people from Mauritius that was transported to Diego Garcia. That was his question.
Thank you, Beatrice. Thank you for contributing and speaking to us. And I think that's an important question, and one which many within some within the Chagossian community are asking, which contributors will be aware of, as to the rights of Chagossians in terms of determining their own future as regard to Chagos and Diego Garcia. And I think it's from. I think what I would say here is actually there's a lot of very different viewpoints about this, both, as you'll know, within the Chagossian community and also from the view that you've articulated, which is a very strong view. And so I wondered if any of our contributors could respond, could add any comment, because I think it's a point that really needs to be discussed.
Could I make one comment? And that is the Chagos refugees group, the majority group of Chagossians, indeed they may be very well the majority of all Chagossians, fully supports the agreement as it is.
Thank you, David. Anyone else like to contribute, or any comments building upon what Maxwell and then Beatrice have said? Because I think it's important to have a very inclusive discussion and to hear from different viewpoints.
I think I would maybe just add, and it actually relates to what you just said about the inclusivity of the discussion, Chris, is that this is part of the outcomes that has arisen because it's being treated as a negotiation between two states parties, and that while there have been I guess conversations, you could call them, with Chagossian groups in certain Chagossian groups in certain parts of the world, that doesn't constitute a full consultation process with an entire community, and that is why some of the varied points of view are not being seen in the draft agreement, or even in the correspondence surrounding the draft agreement. So I think what Maxwell and Beatrice and also Ian and Ian's question are pointing to is that lack of inclusivity at the level of the negotiations, which have not been fully inclusive and have not fully consulted with the community at large.
So thank you, Laura. And Maxwell, I see you have another question.
Is it Maxwell or is it me? Beatrice.
Beatrice.
Sorry, because you said Maxwell earlier and it was me.
Beatrice.
Yeah, no,
Maxwell or Beatrice. It's be great to hear from either of you.
Sorry. Yeah, I just wanted to agree with Laura. Is it? Sorry. Yeah. We were not consulted. How do they know it's the majority of Chagossian? We were never consulted. And those people who's saying yes, most of them don't speak English. Most of them can't read. So they taking whatever the people who's representing them is telling lies. And we have proof. There's live videos being made on Facebook that those people are not sending the right message to those people who are saying yes. And we were not consulted either. Thank you.
Thank you, Beatrice. And I think a very important theme of this discussion here and the book is different perspectives, different views, and to actually have an inclusive dialogue, because this is incredibly important. And as Laura said, in a negotiation between two states, there is the inevitable exclusion of the population to be involved in the dialogue. And I think, as we said in the beginning, there's lots of viewpoints within the Chagossian community. They're very quite strong, legitimately held views across all sides of the community. And I think really it's a chance to have this dialogue discussion in a respectful, which we've done here, in a way that listens to everybody. So I think for our final question, if that's okay, we've got David Vine, who very kindly has organised today. So over to you, David.
I was going to respond to the good question that Maxwell and Beatrice raised, or sort of set of questions, but it did look like Maxwell, I think, may have had another question, unless that's Beatrice's hand from earlier.
Thanks,
Hi,
David.
hi. Thank you for letting me intervene again. Yes. For us, the Chagossians, it's a deep betrayal. Back in the 1965, and there are some very, very good documents which even Mr. David Vine has written with Laura Jeffery. But the principle of self-determination, of people giving their voice, of people not being colonized, this is what is happening to the Chagossians. When we are still the last colony of Africa, when this deal is passed, we are still, us the Chagossians people, are still going to be the last colony of Africa, because we will be under the Mauritian colony. And you know, the Mauritius government, how they've treated the Chagossians, this is why there's such a strong feeling that is opposing this deal. We were treated far worse than second-class citizens. Mr. David Vine has written on this. And, you know, it's time for the world to see our suffering. It's time for the world to give us the chance to decide our future. We cannot just keep feeding off scraps from the British government, from the Mauritian government. If this still goes ahead, I was in the meeting with the FCDO person yesterday. If this deal goes ahead, there's nothing that will give to the Chagossians. Resettlement is in the hands of Mauritius government. They will do whatever they want. Compensation is in the hands of the government, the Mauritius government. The UK is not giving any compensation to the Chagossians. They're only giving a trust fund, which they have given for the last 65 years, that has not helped the Chagossians. And the Chagossians cannot go to Diego Garcia, which is being said that it's a crime against humanity. Whenever they don't let us go back to our home, they don't let us go back to Diego Garcia, be a crime against humanity. And yesterday, the FCDO person said, we are not going back to Diego Garcia, we're only going to visit Diego Garcia. So how does this deal stop the suffering? How does this deal give the Chagossians their human rights? The Seychelles has never received anything. There are Chagossians in Agalega. How are we sure that the Mauritian government will now compensate the Seychelles? They've never been given anything. Thank you.
Thank you, Maxwell. And it's very important to hear different views within the Chagossian community, and also to add to the academic views and the activist views put forward by contributors. And I think this has been I've been humbled to actually hear from our contributors, to actually hear some beautiful poetry, the contribution now from Maxwell and Beatrice, and also from people who've had a long role in the proceedings, such as David Snoxell, been absolutely pivotal in terms of actually pushing the issue here domestically within the UK. So David Vine has got his hand up. David.
I did just want to respond a bit to Maxwell and Beatrice's comments, which I think are incredibly important. And if there's anyone else who wants to respond as well, I think it could be helpful. Obviously, it's a longer and bigger conversation than we have time for, but I think it's completely understandable that some people would, in the Chagossian community and beyond, would be opposed to the deal for multiple reasons, and beginning with the continued ban on resettlement on Diego Garcia, that would be reason alone to reject the deal. But I think the larger question of Chagossian self-determination is one that Maxwell is correct. That the international community has not prioritized the right of Chagossians to determine their own political future. Now, I will say, from my perspective, it does appear that in recent years, the Mauritian government has provided more support to the Chagossian people than in decades. I think there are very understandable reasons why many Chagossians would be very angry at not just the British government, not just the US government, but the Mauritian government for treatment they have received for many, many years. But what seems to be the alliance between the Mauritian government and at least parts of the Chagossian community since the taking of the case to the International Court of Justice signals, and not just signals, but it is a form of greater support for Chagossians than ever before. Now, all that said, if the deal goes forward, there will be a lot of work required to ensure that the Mauritian government prioritizes Chagossians resettling in the Chagos Islands and paying compensation to all Chagossians living in Mauritius, Chagossians living in the UK, Chagossians living in Seychelles and elsewhere. It is certainly possible that the Mauritian government would back away from its promises, and Chagossians and allies will have to make sure that the Mauritian government, as well as the British government, that they live up to their promises in any finalized deal. And I would just echo what someone said, I think it was David Snoxell, that if Mauritius retakes sovereignty, that I know many Chagossians envision a form of autonomy in the Chagos Islands similar to that which people in Rodrigue, part of Mauritius, enjoy, so that self-determination can be addressed in a variety of ways, including with a degree of autonomy within the Mauritian state.
Thank you, David. And I think at this juncture now, to bring questions to and comment to an end, and I'd like to hand back to David Vine. But before I hand back to David, I'd just like to reiterate, thank you very much, David, for organising today, for having it streamed on Facebook Live, in terms of having our dialogue translated. And thank you for everyone who's attended, who's asked questions, who's put forward their own views. It's been an absolute, as I said, humbling opportunity to actually hear from people with very distinct views, who have actually, with Beatrice in terms of born on Chagos Islands, and to hear from people. So thank you. So I'd like to hand back to David Vine. Thank you, David.
Oh, that's kind. And I feel like I've said plenty. I will just read a couple comments, but also just thank everyone for joining us today. And I do also want to again thank our interpreter, Amira Arjani, who was very kind to help us today. And to be a sole interpreter for an hour and a half is an extremely difficult task. So thank you especially to Amira. But I will just read a comment or two from the chat, because that won't appear in the video later. Egla Rose says, just a thought, I know of a family in Seychelles who were deported from Diego Garcia when they were compensated, quote unquote, and received a British passport.
only part of the family received such, the reason being that some children were not born in Diego, but in Seychelles. And indeed, the comment points to the difficulty that some Chagossians have had in securing a British passport and UK citizenship. There were another comment or two about the extent to which Shahim Bahal, asked to what extent is Mauritius considering the Chagossian self-determination, and that I think is an open question. Laura, do you want to, or Mairi, do you want to close us out? I would just thank everyone again for being here and joining us, and looking forward to continuing the conversation and the work together.
Yes, sure. So thank you all so much for coming, and we can now say that the book is officially and formally launched. We urge you all to continue the conversation, and we hope, many of us hope to have an opportunity to work together again in future, and including with new collaborators amongst these people and others. And in the event that an agreement is finally announced, we will try to organize a follow-up event. But in the meantime, thank you so much for coming, and special thanks to David for coordinating the book launch.